Dr. Fatton, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Um, After the assassination of Haiti's president, Jovenel Moïse, in July 2021, we heard and read a lot more about Haiti than before. And by we, I mean we Americans. And one subject that is frequently reported on is the gangs in Haiti. But I'm not even sure if the term gangs is the correct word here because of the scale of their operation and their impact in Haiti. So let's talk about them. Who are these gangs? Where do they come from?
Yeah, well, the gangs are not a new phenomenon in Haiti.
Not
Uh,
new. Okay.
no, it's not new. The scope of their activities is much wider now, clearly. But historically, uh, when Haiti was not centralized, I'm talking about the late 19th century, early 20th century, you had gangs. They were kind of armed bands that were to a large degree dependent on politicians in the different provincial areas of Haiti. So they were, to some extent, the armed weapon of those politicians when they wanted to get power. But it wasn't, as significant as we have now. The gangs in the modern form have really started to crystallize in the late 1990s and early 2000. And initially they
Oh,
were,
so way before this assassination.
oh yes, we've had gangs. They were not as powerful because they
Okay.
were tied to politicians, they were tied to the business community, they were tied to the government. And to understand why the gangs crystallized at that time, one must remember that in 1994, when President Aristide came back to the country, he abolished the army. And there was an attempt to create an effective police. And the police has never been effective. Now it's completely disintegrating. But it was very poorly armed, very poorly trained. There was a lot of corruption. It wasn't as bad as it is now, but still, it was not an effective force. And given the instability in the political system, different factions of the political class started creating their own gangs. The business community started also creating its own gangs. And when you had the confrontation between Aristide and the Lavalas movement and members of the old army and members of the business elite, then all of those groups created their gangs. And they were dependent on the financial support of those different factions. Now, what has happened lately is that the gangs have essentially autonomy in the sense that while they may still have connections to the different factions of Haiti's political class and economic class, they are nonetheless quite independent, and it's very difficult to control them. And
Wow.
they are much better armed. Actually, many people would argue that they have better weapons than the police itself. There is a massive traffic of guns and things of that sort entering Haiti. And in addition to that, the gangs have also been tied to the drug business. So the drug business, the now pervasive pattern of kidnappings, etc., is nurturing financially those gangs. And it is estimated, actually, the crisis group had an analysis about a year or 2 years ago. And at the time, there were about 200 gangs, according to them. But in
200 gangs?
200 gangs, yeah.
Oh,
Not
wow.
all of them are significant, but
Okay.
that was the estimate. What has happened lately, though, is that in about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, in 2020, the gangs federated. So many gangs which were fighting among themselves decided to create an alliance. And you have an alliance of the so-called G9, which is also known as famille et alliés, which is a Creole word to mean the family and its allies. And that is probably the best known group because it's led by a former member of the police, a fellow by the name of Cerisier, Jimmy Cerisier, who's
A
also
gang is led by a former member of the
yes,
police.
absolutely, yeah,
Oh boy.
and he's
Okay.
known as barbecue because his mother used to sell on the streets.
Oh boy.
So, and actually, there are several members of the police who have been implicated in the gangs. And this tells you the level of corruption that there is in the police. But Cerisier is one of the best known gang leaders in Haiti. And you have another major group, which is called J Peuple, which means the People's Group. And that one is headed by a fellow by the name of Gabriel Jean-Pierre. Those are the two main groups. And the coalition has attempted to lessen the violence between the gangs. But in recent weeks, the violence has increased significantly. I mean, last weekend, there was something like 30 people killed, and not very far from the American embassy, which is actually on the road to the airport in Port-au-Prince. So violence is really pervasive, and it is estimated that something like 60 to 80% of Port-au-Prince is now under the control of one gang or another.
Wow.
So the government has basically lost its capacity to control the environment within which it is functioning. And last week, for the first time, the gangs were quite close to the private residence of the Prime Minister Ariel Henry. There were shots fired. So there is a feeling that public order, it's not a feeling, it's a reality now, that public order has completely disintegrated. And in the slums, the conditions are really dire. The struggle and the fights between different gangs have led to a massive population displacement, which is a real problem for Port-au-Prince. Something like 130 to 150,000 people, essentially coming from the slums, have been displaced because they want to avoid being in the gang warfare.
So where are they going to if they have been
this is
displaced?
the real problem. They are in the streets now. The government has doesn't really have the means to take care of that population. There are some NGOs which are trying to feed them, but it's extremely it's becoming a humanitarian catastrophe. And the UN has actually mentioned that, and it's one of the reasons that there has been persistent calls on the part of the UN for some form of external peacekeeping or intervention so that they could control the violence and control the proliferation of the gangs, and that the government would retake control of order in Port-au-Prince. And it's not just Port-au-Prince now, because in the Valley of the Artibonite, which is the main area where Haitians produce their foodstuff, well, that has been also clearly affected by an increased level of violence on the part of the gangs. And last year, there was a real problem in terms of accessing oil in Port-au-Prince and elsewhere, because the gangs controlled the road that led to the oil deposits in Haiti, which meant that there was a crisis. Eventually, it was there was a negotiation between gangs and the government and some sectors of the business community, and but occasionally the gangs resurface when they need real money, and if you want to move your oil, you have to pay the gangs. They control the area. They control the area going to the south, and now it's becoming increasingly clear that they are taking control the areas, the main highways leading to the north. So if you want to go to Jérémie, Les Cayes, it's extremely dangerous if you're leaving from Port-au-Prince. And one of
Dr. Fatton, if I may interrupt you and just peel back some of what you said to better understand the background, the history. And pardon me if some of these questions are naive. They just come from the perspective of an American who doesn't know much about Haiti. Why did Aristide abolish the military? A country needs a military.
Well, you have to put yourself in the context of the mid-1990s. You remember Aristide was overthrown by the military.
Yes,
and
yes.
Now that the military were to a large degree a danger to Haitian society. And the military in Haiti have had a very nasty history of repressing the population. And in addition to that, when Aristide came back, there were all kinds of international groups and countries saying, well, you don't really need an army, you just need a police. And they took the example of Costa Rica as the critical example, whereby it's better to have a police and not a huge military. And in fact, Aristide, when he abolished the military, and you have to remind yourself that Haiti is still a very macho kind of society. He painted where the military was, the Caserne des Salines. He painted the whole thing pink, and he put the ministry
for a macho nation. We painted it pink.
He painted it pink, and he put the Ministry of Women's Condition in the former military spot.
That's almost like an insult to macho military men.
That's exactly that, and it was intended to be so. But the problem is that very quickly, people who are resisting Aristide and people who are supporting Aristide and members of the business community started paying very poor people to form gangs. It was a micro phenomenon, but it started.
Wait, they did that to protect their own communities,
protect their own interest, etc. Yeah.
So what about the police? Earlier you said police wasn't able to become effective. Why is that?
Well, a lot of money has been spent on the police in the 90s and from during the MINUSTA period. MINUSTA was the United Nations peacekeeping forces, which were in Haiti from 2004 to 2017, and they were supposed to create a police, an effective police. At one point, it looked like it was going to work, but then things started to fall apart, in particular after the earthquake of 2010. So it was, and the police has been also besieged by internal fights and by the politicization of the police. Each government wants to put someone which is supporting essentially the current government. So it has lost its independence. And in addition, there was a crisis in the police. People were not paid very well. So with their weapons, they started allying themselves with some of the gangs. And as I've said, Jimmy Cherizier Barbecue is the paradigmatic figure of that. He's become the best known gang leader in Haiti. And he presents himself not just as a gang leader. Actually, he would refuse to accept that appellation. He sees himself as someone fighting for the people in the slums. He has a vision of himself as kind of a Robin Hood. Although in reality, this is very different because the people who have suffered most from these gangs are poor people in the slums. They've been displaced. And it's really one of the great tragedies.
Let me ask this question as you talked about Barbecue and his gang. Again, I wonder whether or not even the word gang makes sense because they're so massive and their operation is such a huge scale. As they take over a certain territory, don't the leaders of these gangs have some interest in creating stability within their own territory. They're almost becoming like little mini governments, right?
Yes, that's the case. Actually, you can more or less look at it as a mafia phenomenon. You know, you take an area, and actually, in the history of the creation of modern states, a lot of military gangs, if you want to call them that way, started to control the areas, started to impose taxes. The violence subsided because they wanted legitimacy.
Yeah,
But the problem is that you have so many gangs and they are all fighting each other to control territory. So you can't really impose order in a more consensual way. You have to impose order with the gun.
I
And this
see.
is why you have had that massive exodus of people, in particular from the very poor areas of the capital and from the slums. You know, it's a significant number when you're talking about 150,000 people who have been internally displaced as a result of the
Yeah.
violence. It's really significant.
And hundreds of thousands were previously displaced in the 2010 earthquake, and then again some in the
Absolutely.
2021
Yeah, I
earthquake.
mean, yeah.
Are any of these gangs, Dr. Fatton, sort of ideologically founded or racially or religiously founded, or no, it's just for uh, power and profit?
I would argue it's essentially for power and profit.
Okay.
But one has to also understand the socioeconomic conditions within which gangs are formed. The gangs are really composed of very young people, and some of the members of the gangs are teenagers. They don't have a future in Haiti. There are no jobs. They don't have money. And that's to some extent an easy way to make some money and to feel that you're a big man, as it were, when you
You're a
have
big
a
shot.
weapon.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there is that phenomenon. Uh, the conditions in the slums are such that there is no avenue to make it in any fundamental way. So when you have gangs, the gangs provide an exit from that dire condition. This is not to idealize the gangs, but it's to understand how they are created, the poverty that exists in those areas, the absence of a future is such that a lot of young people join the gangs, and also there is coercion. I mean, you are drafted, and you'd better come.
Yeah.
So it's an element of coercion. It's an element of well, I'm going to have a gun now. I'm part of a movement, and some of the gangs, as I've said, in particular, Barbecue, has portrayed himself as
A Robin Hood.
Exactly. And you can see him on YouTube's. I mean, it's a really bizarre phenomenon when you have
That's really brazen. He's not even shy about it.
absolutely.
There's a
It's
certain
amazing.
level of legality and
Yeah,
legitimacy to himself.
absolutely. I mean, there is a very interesting event that occurred, I think it was last year. The prime minister was going to the tombstone of the founder of the country, Jean-Jacques Dessalines.
Yeah.
He always gives a speech and puts flowers. And Jimmy Cherizier, Barbecue, decided that he was not going to go. So the prime minister had to retreat. He couldn't give his speech, and he couldn't put the flowers there.
Oh my gosh.
And 2 hours afterwards, who shows up?
Barbecue shows up
with a gun, with about a few thousand of his followers, with flowers, and he gave a speech on YouTube. So
this is how powerful he is.
It is extremely powerful. And at one point, people were saying that he had been nurtured financially by the former president, that there were connections between Jovenel Moïse and Cherizier. And some people say that the business community has also had to pay him, because if you want to get the oil, you need to have access to the road. So there are all kinds of very opaque connections.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to determine who's who and who's behind certain groups. And those alliances are ever changing.
Yeah. So we have 200 gangs, and one of them that we talked about more
Yeah, yeah,
under Mr.
yeah,
Barbecue, G9, seems to be running just roughshod with the country.
yeah. Although there are
Uh,
new gangs that have appeared, and especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, that
oh,
have
wow.
taken other areas of Port-au-Prince, and it's not clear what is going to happen. As I've said, some of the gangs have been very close to the American embassy, which actually closed its facilities in the last week and a half because it was very dangerous, and most of the non-essential personnel of the American embassy has left the country. So
So
we
we
are
essentially don't have an embassy in
well, there's
Haiti
an
any.
embassy, but it's an embassy that is working half time essentially for especially for the few remaining Americans in Haiti. But
So
it
given all this violence and gangs, we talked about some of them. Who are these vigilante groups? Who would have the guts to stand up to these? These are citizens, I imagine.
yes, and that is not new either. This is a pattern that you have in Haiti when you have gangs taking over that people, because they don't have the protection from the police, they take matters into their own hands.
Are these
And
middle class people or what
it's
sort of?
essentially poor people now,
Uh-huh.
because the poor people are the ones who are suffering the most from that.
Okay.
It's there, uh, not to say that rich people are not suffering from it either, because they are suffering from kidnappings and ransoms, things of that sort. But that started to crystallize in last April, and it spread. It's called bois calé, which is a Creole word which means essentially peel wood, and those are vigilante groups, and they took by surprise the gangs, and they were extremely violent. In other words, if you're a gang member and they took you, you would be dead, and the police would not do anything. Something like 350 people have been killed in the process.
But how are these vigilante groups armed?
All kinds of different weapons. I mean, they have baseball bats, they have rocks. I mean, they swarm, a group, and they just. I mean, there are videos actually of how they do it, and it started very spontaneously, but now it has taken more of a more organized way. In other words, neighborhoods have kind of groups. The danger with that movement is just that it may get out of hand too, and that
They
you
may
can
turn into a gang themselves.
yeah, or they may also settle scores with people who have nothing to do with the gangs. uh,
Ah,
the other danger, and this is particularly salient in what has transpired in the last 2 weeks, is that the gangs have regrouped, and now they are attacking the vigilante, and
oh
this is
boy.
what. So this is where is getting very nasty, because the gangs are better armed, clearly, and they are threatening anyone who's part of those vigilante group, or what in Haiti some people see it as popular justice. And this
Um,
again is not completely new. When Duvalier fell in 1986, the Tonton Macoute, which were the paramilitary group, were attacked by popular justice. If you're a member of the Macoute, you would be in really serious danger. And some of the Macoutes were killed in the streets, burned, etc. So this is not something that is new. It's something that you can understand given the ugliness of the violence in the slums and in the poor areas, whereby people have no protection whatsoever. So ultimately, they decide to take justice into their own hands.
have any of these vigilante groups ever been able to form some sort of movements that gives rise to a legitimate government? I think I know
Not
the answer
really,
to
but
that. Go
not
ahead.
really, but you have studies of previous vigilante groups which were well organized in terms of neighborhoods, and they had people who were in charge of those groups. And if they knew that there was a gang in the area, they would mobilize to attack the gang.
Yeah.
But the problem is that they are not as well armed, as I've said. It's kind of, there is an unbalanced asymmetry of power there.
Yeah.
So
would you, as you were describing all of this, in the closing question of this segment, I'm wondering what you would call this. This is not a civil war. It's not 2-3 groups. It's sort of so many different things are happening.
Yeah, I think it's a disintegration of public order.
Okay.
In a very, very poor society. And at least in the case of Haiti, I think that really generates morbid symptoms. In other words, kind of a Hobbian war of all against all without organized sides, as it were. And especially when you have a government that is completely illegitimate in the eyes of most of Haitians and has no capacity to impose order and no capacity to offer a future to the country. So you have a void of public authority, a void of legitimacy on the part of the political figures. So that leads to that kind of decomposition of society. And it's really a political, economic, moral, as I would argue, decomposition of society.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about foreign intervention in Haiti. We'll be right back.